Excuse me. Shall we start, if you agree? Thank you. So, good morning, everybody. We are going to have the ninth panel of this fascinating workshop. We have two presenters, Francesca Orsini and Mariam Sikander. Francesca Orsini is presenting a paper on multilingual allegories, genre, community, and language ideologies. I will not waste any more your time and ask Francesca to start when she's ready.
Sorry. Sorry. Okay. Sorry about that. Thank you very much, everybody, for being so engaged. I had very little time to put together this, so I apologize if it's very tentative. But I've been fascinated by this material for a long time. Okay. Okay. Right. So my presentation picks on an insight by Christopher Pinney, who has worked on early photography in India, that in the early periods, that is between the 1870s and 1890s, of intimacy between lithography and theater, as he says, the nation was involved primarily through allegory. And his argument is that you have an early kind of phase of allegory that does all, as he says, this kind of laborious work of putting together a semiotic infrastructure of connections and meanings and affect and discourse that then is necessary for allegory to be superseded by figure, whether it's the figure of Mother India as the nation or the figure of Gandhi as the nation. And he talks about the fact that allegory sort of emerges in this kind of conjunction between lithography, so this kind of lithographic images, and the space of theater. And I would say, the plays that I'm going to talk about, the two plays I'm talking about today, were not actually performed, but they still participate in this kind of interocular, has it been called, sort of relationship between lithography and the stage. And the strategy they pursue is one based, as we will see, on the combination, layering, and juxtaposition of heterogeneous elements and fragments in order to crystallize meaning and mobilize collective feelings. That's basically my argument. And in this sense, the allegories I'm talking about don't work as another kind of allegory that you also have. So, you can have the allegory, you can have a Ramayana in which Ram becomes, Ravan becomes the foe of the nation, and Ram becomes the hero of the nation, and so there's a parallel level of signification. Here, as you already could see in the previous one, it's actually a kind of a combination of very heterogeneous elements. A combination of types, fragments of discourse, literal and metaphorical meanings, registers of speech, sartorial and other symbolism, and reaccented registers of songs. Often in these plays, narrative and action are minimal or absent. Characters could be called illocutionary, I can't find a better word, in the sense that they don't really do anything, they're just there. I am darkness. And you have to, and this is what I am. I'm both metaphorical darkness and real darkness. And that's it. It's who they are, what they say and what they look like that attracts attention and creates pathos, not what they do or how they act. And it's this dazzling play of concepts, images, signifiers, and affects that arrests and grabs attention. And before any meaning is settled, for example, there's a character called English Policy, and he's dressed like a band baja, in a kind of uniform. And before we can think of, what's the relationship between English policy and Ben Baja, we are rushed already in the next scene. Now, this was not an unfamiliar structure by this time. If we think of the kind of spectacular parade-like quality of early stage, like the Inder Sabha, the first successful stage drama in North India. And in a way, I think the allegorical plays that I'm talking about have a lot in common with it. At a broader level, by focusing on this rather small body of plays, I don't know if two plays make a genre, I want to push further Chris Pinney's argument that Benedict Anderson's model of nationalism is a highly cerebral construct invoking flows of discourses in a world stripped of its materiality. So it's actually not a kind of not rich enough an idea of nationalism to explain what the phenomenon and its appeal are. Of course, Benedict Anderson's genres of choice, you will recall, are the newspaper and the novel. By contrast, I would argue, the great popularity of allegorical plays, images, songs, and poems with their dangerous corporeality, as Chris Pinney would put it, and the embodied accents of stereotype characters, strong feelings aroused and intensified by the tunes and beats of familiar songs, shows that it was genres other than the novel that played a significant role in arousing national feelings and making the nation an entity that people could relate and feel for, not just an idea. And I think it's interesting that in these plays, discourses and speeches feature, but they feature as part of this bigger kind of ensemble, in a more symbolic and epic struggle between good and evil, friend and foe. Moreover, whereas Anderson's emphasis on the novel as the primary genre for imagining the nation lends itself to a diffusionist model of war literature, and we've talked a lot about that, in which the matrix is given and what change are local color and voice, the genre of allegorical plays highlights a different significant geography from that of imperial centers and colonial peripheries. This is a more regional trajectory in which Bengal acted as the inspiration for Hindi plays, while the song genres, characterization, and humor drew on a landscape of musical genres and performances that greatly exceeded Bengal, at once more regional and more diffuse. And finally, before I turn to my 3 points and examples, I would like to pose the comparative question. Given the scholarship, for example, on Asian punches, so the fact that you have punch and then you've got really different, similar but locally inflected and kinds of punches emerging in our areas. So given that the scholarship on Asian punches has shown the proliferation of local versions of satirical journals and cartoons, I would like to know if you can think of comparative examples for this allegorical play and the work they do in your regions and languages. Now, the two plays that I focus on were written within 15 years of each other and were part of the early phase of the Hindi movement, when Hindi writers looked largely to Bengal, to Calcutta for inspiration, and combined patriotism with loyalty to the British rule and Raja Rajeshwari Victoria, and at the same time with a sharpening criticism of British officers in India and the colonial drain of wealth. They come accompanied by even if they were not actually performed, they come with stage direction about what each character is dressed, and the musical mode, and sometimes the beat and the tune of each song. So Bhartendu Harishchandra's allegorical play, poem Bharat Bhiksha, and then his play Bharat Durdasha, The Sad State of India, defined, as you can see, as the Indian folk a dancing opera, sort of responded to a Bengali sort of similar poem. I'm not sure about a play. And it has characters first introducing themselves and then singing a song, like a recitativi and arias in an opera. Badrinarayan Chaudhary Prem Khan's Bharat Saubhagya, and he was active in Mirzapur, the very same place of Ramkarib Chaube that we heard about yesterday. So I'm talking about Benares and Mirzapur in what were then the United Provinces up there. So it was written in a hurry for the 1889 session of the Indian National Congress that was going to take place in Allahabad in about a month. In the end, it was not performed because the students of Muir College, who had asked him to write the play, could not borrow a stage on which to perform it, but he published it anyway. Both plays feature a foe of Bharat, no? So an enemy of Bharat, of India, who commands an army of generals and soldiers ready to attack and finish off Bharat, or India, which is still imagined as a male figure, not the mother India yet, and a friend of India who has a parallel but weaker set of helpers. Briefly, I want to just show you how they are. So their structure, as you can see, it's not a narrative structure. Each scene changes, setting changes, characters, and let me see. Right. So you have it at first. You have a yogi who sings a song saying "Weep together," and different affects are aroused by the songs and the characters. Then you have King Bharat lying in rags with a half crown, kind of giving a soliloquy and then singing, "No one grasps my hand, I have millions of suns, yet I wander helpless, hi, hi." Then you've got Bharat Durdev, the foe, and his commander Satyanash, destruction, who sing and dance. Then the helpers come in, Rogue, Alasya, Madira, and they all darkness, Andhakar, they all parade and sing. Then you have an act with a library, in a library scene, completely different, with the chairman, editor, and poet who are discussing, having a kind of, meeting about what should be done to save India, which gets disrupted by the end. It's a very funny scene. And then you get back to a kind of lament, lament for the past glory. And there you have India's fortunes, who tries to raise Bharat with another song. Then has a long soliloquy about the past greatness of India, and then takes out a dagger and kills himself in a very kind of tragic way. Bharat Saubhagya is a similar, has a much larger set of characters, about 100 characters. So difficult to imagine. I mean, the students would have had to change dress a lot of times. And you have these sort of two sets of characters, almost parallel. You've got India and fortune. You can see the children, how the nation is imagined, north, east, west, and then Muslim, Parsi, and English, all the children of India. Helpers, here we have different kind of sets of activities, I suppose, industries and activities. You've got gods, you've got semi-goddesses, which again are kind of abstract concepts. You've got all the necessary qualities appear as apsaras, nymphs. You've got the viceroy and English policy, education and freedom as characters. And in the last scene, last act, you have actually, they go to Parliament, and you have Queen Victoria, Charles Bradlaugh, Gladstone, Liberal Party, Radical Party, Conservative, Lord Bishop, English nation, all as characters. So these are the friends of India, these are the enemies of India. So you have Badik Bale Hind and his Queen Jahalat. You've got his helpers, Distraction, Markat, Rudlat, Tortar, Pumpar. You've got their wives, which again you can see are abstract, and his officials, which again are kind of, the ills, the typical ills. You've got, interesting, the residents, who seem to be a bit comical, bak bak chak chak tak 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 tak. You've got their wives. Interestingly, they start out with these sort of Urdu names, Kahili, Beparwai, Ayashi, Kamhimmati, Lamazhabi. And then at some point, they put on English gowns, and they become idleness, ease, luxury, cowardice, and free thinking. And it's exactly, this kind of, synapses, I would say, that happen. It's not a narrative, but when is it that, what does it mean that Kahili becomes idleness, wearing a gown? And this is, again, not much of a, there's a general narrative of attack of Badik Balkan on India, and the goddesses are leaving India, Durga and Lakshmi and so on, no point staying here anymore, until the Viceroy steps in. The Viceroy steps in, and the Viceroy says, well, he starts every sentence with, well. It's he's actually speaking Hindi with an English accent. Well, when I came from Vilayat, I thought this was a rich country, but now it looks lifeless. There's Bharat there lying on the floor. Oh, he's still alive. He's got a pulse. Why don't you speak? Well, he's got the press act locking his mouth. Ah, how can he speak in English? Awareness enters, dressed in pink, and then leaves. Bharat, how? And then he opens the lock. How can I thank you, great soul? Well, and then the Viceroy tells all the things that he's doing. You've got songs, and I'll talk a little bit about songs in a minute. One song one act is about the previous session of the Indian National Congress in Madras, and one song has all the names of the delegates in it. So a song with the names of the delegates. Yeah, and that's the end. Right, my main points. This is just to give you a sense of what they were like. How much do I have? 5 minutes. Right.
I have 8.
Yeah, okay. So the plays, as you can see, align characters on two sides of a simple axis. So you've got actually quite a lot of elements, characters and so on, but the simple axis. Bharat and his children and friends, and the foes. So whereas the modes of address are quite varied, lament, exhortation, homily, humor, satire, celebration, tragedy, discursive analysis, and so on. There are speeches that I haven't talked about. In the form of historical, there's an act in which you have industry and others coming and giving witness to the sad state of India. Political fantasy, going to Parliament and Victoria saying, of course I will grant you what you want. Hame koi uzr nahi hai. The emotional investment is straightforward and the choice is simplified. We are invited to side with Bharat and reject his foes. This interleaving and layering of argument, symbol, and feeling in order to produce simple side-taking and emotional identification is what I would say the complex groundwork that allegory performs. I've got just two more points that I want to make. One is about characters and language stylization. Again, it seems to me that it's really interesting that one groundwork that these plays do is to evoke through stylization of language. So, trade is a Marwari. Service, Naukri is a Bengali. You've got one act in Premkand's play which is all about the mutiny, 1857, taking the side of the British, saying, this is a terrible thing that the mutinies do. And you've got all the characters defined by their accent and what they say. So you've got the Bhojpuriya Hindu, you've got the Maratha Hindu, one speaks Bhojpuri, the other speaks Marathi. You've got the English Mem Sahab and the children. You've got the Sikh coming and saving them. And the other point is about so you've got a familiar social stereotype that is made to carry political signification. And the last point really is about the affective power of songs. And I think songs are really the ubiquitous genre of 18th and 19th century North India. And it seems to me that songs, intensify the import of a statement. So just saying wake up, weep together, you put it to a song and it carries much more emotional weight. They carry their own affective connotation. So for example, you've got wine, Madira, who's dressed like a woman performer, who sings a Dhamari rag kafi, which is a light rag associated with the courtesan's repertoire. And then you've got the same raga sang by darkness, and rag kafi is a midnight raga. You've got Kachli, which is a women's song of the area, and it's sung by good characters, intelligence, knowledge. It's the one that does the Congress delegates. So you've got these songs that already have some affective, connotations, which are made to carry new political ones. You've got Ragadesh, country, which of course is used for all these political songs to praising Queen Victoria. You've got this interesting use of English raga, and you've got, in fact, the reuse of a famous Persian ghazal by Hafiz that was much liked by English in India, which is called the ghazal in English rhythm, whose words are even changed and used to in a scene where where the foe of Bharat is attacking India. Right. Sorry, to conclude.
You have 4 minutes.
Oh, I got 4 minutes. Okay, right. And to me, it's really interesting. So to see, you know, again, a part of the work that is being done by the use of these songs in these allegorical plays. So you get a Persian ghazal popular in musical parties within the colonial contact zone that gets refashioned as the Urdu song of an invading army. Familiarity, the power of its cadence are made to carry a new ominous feel. So this is wine, Madira, as a woman, instead in Bhaltendu's play. And you can see that part of it is funny. So basically here you have instead the woman performer who again says, you know, actually everybody likes me. Everybody's criticizing, but everybody drinks me. I mean, in fact, the holy drink of all religions. And all this is sort of very tongue-in-cheek. Now, within the context of this play, however, and its lament for the fallen state of India and call to urgent but not specified action, Madira becomes an element of patriotism and nationalism, an emblem of the many ills that India's children have to forsake. But how is wine linked to darkness or to illness? So instead of a discursive argument, the allegorical plays establish visual and emotional synapses through song, dress, and elocution. This allows complexity and contradiction to coexist within a simple moral alignment of friend versus foe. So, and British uniform, for example, is donned by both saviors and by villains. So how did nationalism become a feeling, or rather a bundle of feelings? Pride and shame, anger and love, through other strategies as well, of course, rousing rhetoric, historical myths, iconic figures, through experiences of humiliation, sacrifice, and collective action. But amongst them, I would also like to acknowledge the power and suppleness of allegory. Crispini has defined allegory as referential and discursive in that it offers the theoretical possibility of closure, whereas figure, he says, is a densely compressed, performative, affectively and libidinously changed domain which escapes conventional signification. But in their intensely combinatory logic, the allegories that I've showed today exceed referentiality, I would say, and lean more towards the performative or elocutionary, the affective and the libidinous, particularly as we have seen in the clever use of song, metaphors, and characterization.
Thank you very much, Francesca. So the next presenter is Mariam Sikander from SOAS, and her paper is on upstart punches and pity libellers. Do you use that one?
I'll read from this one.
Do you need the help? Or is that...
So I'll be reading mostly. Just stop me if I'm too fast. Centered around punch-inspired satire in India, this paper is a part of my PhD project on Awadh Punch, an Urdu newspaper dating from 1877 to 1936, and the English Delhi sketchbook, later called Indian Punch, dating from 1850s. Being in the middle of my fieldwork term in India, in this presentation, I hope to flag some preliminary questions, both old and new, and share some new findings about my work. Awadh Punch was a late 19th century weekly periodical founded, edited, and published by Munshi Sajjad Hussain in 1877, published in Lucknow. It was modeled on the famous English humorous magazine Punch, which was the inspiring source of no less than 70 Punch-styled newspapers in Urdu itself in India. In 1862, an article in Charles Dickens' All the Year Round pronounces the Asiatic temperament ill-suited for comedy. I quote, "A professed jest must surely be out of place among a people who have but little turn for comedy. A Bengali or a Hindustani can laugh at what is ridiculous, but his laughter is contemptuous and it may be malignant. Not for the indolent Asiatic does Punch disport himself in India, but for the active European. It is to our brave and fair compatriots in the East that Punch appeals." Unquote. The writer of the article was one Sidney L. Blanchard, and the magazine he was referring to was called the Delhi Sketchbook. Referring to itself as Punch Junior, the Delhi Sketchbook was an illustrated monthly magazine published at the Delhi Gazette Press from 1850 to 1857. Blanchard's article was right in pointing out that its target audience and subject of ridicule were the manners of the British in India, but Punch did not disport itself in India only for its brave and fair compatriots. It soon spawned localized varieties of punches in regional languages with no less than 100 punches in India alone, and Awadh Punch was one such exercise from a people who had but little turn for comedy. Recent scholarship on the Asian punches by Hans Harder and Barbara Mittler charts the dissemination and spread of these punch progenies in places as far off as Shanghai and Istanbul, Calcutta and Cairo. At the very onset, a study of Awadh Punch galvanizes the broad question of how a concept originating in one culture travels and transforms and acquires new meanings in a different social context. Recent discussions have underscored this concern by establishing punch as a transcultural phenomenon. These maneuvers are sensitive to hierarchies of precedence and causality, center and periphery, original and copy. In evaluating punch vis-a-vis punch-inspired satire, the local enunciations being a case of not merely creative translation, but fundamental recontextualization. Awadh Punch, like many other regional punches, Bundelkhand Punch, Rewari Punch, Delhi Punch, Punch Bahadur, Sarpanch Hind, in their very name acknowledge a loan or an influence. A cursory look at its visually prolific first page shows Awadh Punch scrawled in English and Urdu, Roman and Arabic scripts, and in later volumes also in Nagari script. The Nazbul Ain or treasure is seen written on the belt of a hybrid variety of Mr. Punch donning a fez cap. In a later version, it changes into the axiomatic phrase, "Wise man is not to be dictated to, but to dictate unto others." Mr. Punch is often seen presiding over a cosmopolitan literary symposium, seated between a Nawab and an Englishman, and surrounded by other social types. This overtly physiognomized cover page seems to invoke multiple ethnicities only to suspend them momentarily under the mandate of play and pleasure. The hybrid form of the punch figure indicates an avowal of being borrowed, yet at the same time is it also not a license to mock, ridicule and play. Remembered primarily for its cartoons, Awadh Punch also employed genres such as the serialized novel, reportage, skit, sketch and so on. But what was most remarkable was its reformulation of new genres such as dictionary writing, encyclopedic entries, and its parodying of old ones such as the ghazal, the masnavi, and the shehr-e-ashob or the lament. The newspaper was vocal in its ridicule of the westernized elite or the native gentleman on one hand and the pompous Maulvi on the other hand. A celebrated target of satire was the Aligarh school with endless lampooning of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, the late 19th century Muslim reformer. In this cartoon, for instance, he is depicted as a snake charmer or naturey yogi collecting donation for his MAO college. The word nature, owing to Sir Syed Ahmad Khan's naturalistic exegesis of the Quran, became something of a buzzword in late 19th century Urdu journalism and reformist circles, and many a satirical ghazals are penned under titles such as Nature-ya Shairi or Natural Ghazal. By late 19th century, as idioms of Muslim communitarian identity increasingly took shape, the Urdu vernacular press became a means of both dissemination and contestation within discourses of Muslim interests. How did Awadh Punch, with its humorous journalism, participate in these public debates played out in the periodical press? Did it seek to deflate the self-righteous seriousness of the public intellectual and the ulama alike? The Punch writers contribute to the critique of the Maghribi Tehzeeb. They came from a coterie of English-educated service gentry, and it seems self-ironical. Most of the Punch contributors, including the editor Sajjad Hussain, were English-educated classmates at the newly opened Canning College in Lucknow. The newspaper adopted the masthead of an English seriocomic newspaper and was unequivocal in its allegiance to it. Was this satire therefore self-directed? Commenting on the critique of Babu morality in Bengali literature, Shudipto Kaviraj observes about Bankim Chandra, quote, historical reflection on modernity was not an easy pastime for writers of his time. This reflection led to the tragic realization that colonial modernity was premised on the twin paradox of achieving modernity with subjugation or autonomy without modernity. This line of inquiry that locates the tragicomic nature of humor in the colonial paradox is substantiated in definitions of satire too. Satire, as a literary mode, relies on a fundamental opposition between the intended and the said, and in so doing reflects the tension between norm and actuality. Hans Harder points in the direction of seeing satire as a genre specially suited to convey the asymmetries of the colonial experience, with the emulation of English both a curse and a necessity. This conflict was manifest most powerfully in the neither fish nor fowl status of the native gentleman, subjected to ridicule both by the Anglo-Indian and the vernacular presses. Did Awadh Panch practice satire as self-irony? That's question one. A second question to broach here is, premised on artifice, was satire with its indirect mode of representation practiced as a tactic? What do I mean by that? The vernacular press was allowed but closely watched. Regular reports and summaries of vernacular language newspapers were produced. These reports, called selections from vernacular newspapers and statements of native newspapers, offer insights into the internal politics and workings of the periodical press. In 1867, the government passed the Regulation of Printing Press and Newspaper Act, which required that every book published in India be registered and a copy sent to England for safekeeping. The Vernacular Press Act, also called the Gagging Act, provided the colonial state with power to issue search warrants, seize printing machinery, and storm premises without going to court. Under these circumstances, satire, with its oblique language, became an important means of articulating dissent. The selections, for instance, state that the editor of Awadh Panch was warned twice for publishing inciting material, once in 1909 and then in 1911. On the whole, however, the newspaper is classed as comic, unobjectionable, and the editor a respectable man. Awadh Panch expressed its deep disenchantment with colonial policies like increased taxation, partition of Bengal, and so on, but it did so under the license of skillful playfulness. On one instance, it states that Paisa Akhbar, another Urdu akhbar from Lucknow, speaks with surprise of a monkey in England who has been taught to wear boots, use knives and forks at meals, wash hands and face with soap, smoke cigarettes, and ride a tricycle. Awadh Panch comments that there is nothing wonderful in all of this, as there are monkeys in India who wear coats and trousers, ride horses and drive carriages, speak English, rupture the spleens of men by kicks and blows, and even rule over our people. Conversely, however, it also publishes a couple of months later, in a conciliatory tone, an imaginary letter purporting to be from Islam in India to Christianity, whom he calls his sister. Islam reminds Christianity that they were formerly close neighbors and have lived on most friendly terms, and that if some of his wild children misbehave, their sins should be visited on them and not him. What is also interesting is this inter-newspaper referencing or intertextuality. In another instance, Awadh Panch replies to the English newspaper Englishman on their objection to calling Lord George Hamilton a turnip. The journalist of the article clarifies that he had used the phrase Lord George Shaljam to designate the seeds supplied by him after his lordship's name, in the manner of naming Victoria Park after Her Majesty's name, and that the Englishman's journalists have no knowledge of Urdu. The Awadh Panch goes on to state that it is unjust for the Englishman to accuse a comic newspaper of impertinence and sedition. In an atmosphere of intensifying control over the press, it is interesting to see how avowed comicality becomes a guard against prosecution. Walking the tightrope between regard for government and license, satirical or humorous journalism emancipates the local punches from passive modes of reception and influence and accords them a degree of autonomy or creative freedom. This freedom functions, ironically at times, by a disavowal of this autonomy. For example, Awadh Panch issued a poem called Baatcheet, or Conversation, a dialogue between the editorial voice and its imagined opponent, that ends with the following phrase: "Jo hai bada goi ka mera khayal, to kar London pan se tafsheesh haal." The gist being, if you intend to slander me for what I'm writing, direct your inquiries to London Punch, not me. This acceptance of tutorship works in favor to dodge the colonial censor. Combing through the summaries produced of the vernacular newspapers also led me to some useful empirical data that sheds light on how Urdu comic newspapers formed something of a coterie of influence. I use the word comic as ascribed to them by the police reports produced by government translators. Records state that a certain Sayyid Zahoor Ahmad, publisher of Sarpanch from Shahjahanpur, formerly professor of Arabic and Persian, worked in the Panch Bahadur Press, Bombay for a year before starting his own Panch publication. The description of the editor of another Panch called Panch Bahadur mentions clearly that although the editor has a good knowledge of Urdu and Persian, he does not know English. What I am getting at is set into motion by the Canning College educated Punch writers, consequent varieties of Punch in later years assume a life of their own, where even editors with no working knowledge of English, using only their predecessors as the model, are using the Punch label. Predating these regional punches is a largely overlooked archive of Punch in the Anglo-Indian world, and this is where I'm coming to the second part of my paper. These are brought out primarily to cater to the English-speaking company officers. Calling itself Punch Junior, it was an illustrated magazine printed at the Delhi Gazette Press in 1850. By employing the Anglo-Indian punches as a comparator, I seek to investigate the outcomes of two speech communities coming together, how communicative competence is disrupted, and how humor and satire operate at this encounter of what Pratt has conceptualized as the contact zone. If the public intellectuals in colonial India expressed their appreciation or anxiety at the rapid incorporation of English into Urdu, it is interesting to see the other side of the equation. If Necharia or natural shairi appears in Awadh Punch, Delhi sketchbook has Horatian odes done into the vernacular, speaking of notch and sandal and mogri wreaths, mock heroic Pindaric odes are publishing Pindaric odes or publishing Pindaric odes, or Oriental eclogues where ensigns in the company army discuss mess gossip and complain about the labor of acquiring the Hindustani language. This general disinclination and consequent inability to acquire Hindustani is a favorite animating theme behind mockery and ridicule in Delhi sketchbook. Pages after pages, we are treated to bilingual puns arising from the misrecognitions, misunderstandings, mispronunciation, and jokes and sketches of subordinates puzzled at their superiors' foiled attempts at acquiring the Hindustani language. Dim-witted servants, indolent munshis, khidmatgars, ayahs, truant pankhawalas, and palanquin bearers are no doubt depicted stereotypically. The target of ridicule, more often than not, is the prone to dissipation company soldier and the reprobate civil officer. Servants or subordinates are often the mute and docile witness. The predominant object of satire, however, are the different professional classes of Englishmen, their customs and manners, class jealousy, struggles, and debacles. In this illustration, for instance, a servant catches a mouse and brings it to the notice of his English master, declaring, "Ek aur chor pakda sahib," meaning, "I've caught another culprit." The heedless Englishman, who is also a commissioner, does not bother to look over his newspaper and pronounces his judgment, "Oh bother, give him 3 months jail." While humor arises from the absurdity of the scenario, as the mouse is sentenced to 3 months jail, the satirist impulse is gratified by attacking the reckless dealings of the commissioner. The joke assumes new layers of complexion when occurring in a linguistic contact zone prone to linguistic slippages. One realizes that the servant might also have said chuha, meaning mouse, and not chor. That could have been misheard by the commissioner, a situation exacerbated yet again by his unsure footing in the Hindustani language. For Mary Louise Pratt, a contact zone is a site for linguistic and cultural encounter where power is negotiated and struggle occurs. The zone of contact foregrounds the interactive and improvisational dimensions of colonial encounters. Pratt's insights are particularly useful when studying satire and bilingual punning in the Anglo-Indian press, where humor emerged from the clash of two incongruous cultures, languages, and frames of reference. While my attempt so far has been to thematically link the two Punch archives across social and linguistic barriers to unveil the internal working of humor and satire, my archival work in the last couple of months uncovered a direct zone of contact. The same cartoon is published in Awadh Punch with a literal translation, with the only minor change being that the mouse is now sentenced to 6 months of jail instead of 3. One wonders, however, whether these exercises in selective translations are hardly innocent, as the translated cartoons featuring the docile servant often satirize the colonial master instead. If the newfangled gentleman with his floundering English is the pet target of vernacular satire, officers in Delhi sketchbook are often shown struggling with Hindustani, mixing and switching codes amidst great hilarity. It is also worth pursuing how the bilingual contact zone yielded specialized jargon on both the sides. On both the sides, we see self-critique, where satire also becomes a way of coming to terms. Delhi Sketchbook experiments with genres such as fictive translations of Horatian and Pindaric odes, parodically offering humorous commentary on the social life of the cantonment. Awadh Punch is also remarkable in its experimentation with literary genres, and it is worth emphasizing, for instance, that it carried news under headings such as Maulana Panch ki notebook or Pandit Panch ki diary. On both the sides, we see a playful recasting of lofty genres. Other than ghazal, for instance, Awadh Punch publishes something like Nai Roshni Ki Encyclopedia, offering humorous definitions of fictive disciplines like demacology, with demak literally meaning termite. Demacology, for instance, is defined as that thoroughly useless branch of writing which literally attracts termites. The art of dictionary compilation is mocked with Nai Roshni Ki Dictionary, offering satirical definitions of English words such as honor, civilization, policy, and so on. See, for instance, the dictionary entry of the word thanks that takes a jab at British pleasantries. Angrezi masoom lafzon ka old papa. Khushk tehseen, khushk salam, khushk ehsan. The old papa of all innocent English words, cold praise, cold greeting, cold gratitude. वो पाई जिसके अंदर सिर्फ हवा ही हवा है, वो लफ्ज़ जो दुनिया भर को खुश करने के लिए बिला सर्फ किसी किस्म एक मुजर्रब दवा है, वो इनाम जो साल भर दिलो दिमाग को खून करने का सिला देता है. A pie full of air, a tested medicine for making everyone happy, and a reward for a year's worth of excruciating pain and labor. वो करामत की पुड़िया जिसने बड़े रजवाड़ों की खबर ली है, that word which has tamed the native states of India, वो तस्खीर कुलूब का नुस्खा जो अक्सर सरकारी कागज़ों की पेशानी पर दर्ज है, that heart-winning charm that is often found on the letterhead of government documents. These grandiose sounding entries satirize colonial rhetoric and also comment with anxiety on the influx of English words in Urdu lexicon. Satire or tanz was already an accepted literary genre and a mode of conversation in Urdu, but Punch-inspired satire seems to offer a new language to address modernity. To conclude then, to see literary forms and genres simply as colonial inheritance imposed on writers within subordinated regions is to overlook the fact that literature itself as a common value of the entire space is also an instrument which, if reappropriated, can enable writers, and especially those with the fewest resources, to attain a type of freedom, recognition, and existence within it.
Give us 2 extra minutes. Thank you.
Oh, I had like another introduction.
Okay, thank you very much. We saved 2 minutes, so thank you. I will start I will open the floor for questions, comments. Please.
Mariam, thank you for a very lively and thoughtful paper. I've enjoyed it very much. And I sort of like that framework of proliferation. And, so the distance from the first bunch to its many progenitors, I think, very interesting mapping, and the multilingual scenario is really exquisite. But I have a little difficulty with your use of Pratt. Mm-hmm. Pratt assumes that cultures are entirely separate, and then there is this encounter, which I think is a very ahistorical notion, because it presumes very insular formations which have no knowledge of each other, etc., etc. And I think that mouse is very interesting in that respect. It doesn't actually show two incongruous cultures. It shows two very congruous cultures. I mean, if you think of the Nawabi history of Awadh, etc. I mean, the whole notion of the feudal aristocracy, the loyal servant, the servant actually, becoming a commentary on the master, etc., etc. I mean, these are completely congruent, with the history of the United Provinces, as well as with the history of the rise of the bourgeoisie in England and the aristocracy being seen as decadent. That whole posture is not just the posture of the British bureaucrat. It's also the posture of British landed gentry in the master's library, you know, with the butler or whatever, the retainer. So I would actually, you know, I think this is the intelligibility of that image would be, you know, equal to both, you know, the satirist and the satirized, as it were. It's not a cultural encounter in the, you know, Pratt sense of the word at all.
It was.
Thank you very much for the. I have a couple of queries from Francesca, and also one or two minor things to Sikandar. First, I'll start from the second presentation, where you refer to that cartoon which is produced in both Delhi sketchbook and Punch. This Chuha at Chor or Chuhar at Chor. So, Chuhar is a word for which we use, which is caste loaded term, and we speak generally Chor Chuhar. So that might be one of the possibilities of. So, and obviously you are talking about slippages. This is another kind of real slippage that is coming. Lastly, sorry, the last minor thing about what you are saying is that satire is a mode, right? Where things are being done, basically in terms of content, but more literally, if you, in literary terms, if you see, it is also a kind of, say, what it is doing to the existing mode of representation itself, the genre or the mode that is the genre that it is borrowing from, that is also being parodied. Yeah, so it's not only the object of representation, but the frame, the genre itself that is being caricatured here. For Orsini, this is more a query that is, see, allegory is something which is very important not only in these plays but also in satire. Yeah? If you can clarify a bit more, probably both of you, the relationship between allegory and satire. Yeah? How does it play out in the 19th century things? Yeah, and another is informational piece that, and then I could not get, if you please elaborate, the place of Bengal and its relationship to the Hindi literary sphere. Say, in terms of satire also, Harishchandra is almost plagiarizing Ode to Englishman, on which the Kaviraj has written. When plagiarism is, of course, a historical word here, but how it is being used by Harishchandra, or for that matter, say Bharat Durdasa, you are saying that it is being borrowed. Premghan is again is working on it. So is one lesser known individual writer, Lala Khat Bahadur Mal. He has also written this in Kshatriya Patrika that was serialized. Thank you.
Tu devi fare delle domande? Ok, scusa.
Yeah, I have a question to Francesca. So, I was just thinking in terms of like, precursor of these kinds of allegory. So, for example, even if you take Dhola Maru, then Dhola is not just a name. Dhola is many times also a kind of musical genre. Dhola is also a quality, and Maru is also like a name of instrument and name of a rag also. And same way, like if I can think in terms of Videshiya, then Videshiya is again a quality, the person who is migrating. So Videshiya is in a way like it's not just a name. It's like the person or the characters who is also personifying many of the quality, those quality and those kinds of like that genre also in those terms. Because like it is like in quite interesting way, like in this place, like genre and qualities both are getting embodied. So Dhola Maru, Videshiya, and I think even to that extent, even in Jatra, the way like characters gets named. So it's also modeled on some kinds of like kinds of quality. So I was thinking that maybe like no, of course like no, the period you are taking is interesting, and the way he's using these kinds of like personification is also quite theatricalized in that sense. But I think it has some kinds of precursors even in other genres. Yeah.
And my question, or rather continuing Kumkum's point, however, it seems to me that, in a sense, even if we don't think of them as two cultures coming into contact out of, that seems to exactly what the satire is staging, isn't it? So it's staging it as if you have these two civilizations coming into contact, isn't it? So you might, yeah, okay.
So we go for this first round. Sorry. Okay. One more, and then we go for.
Following the interesting was, like Mark Chuha, I would like to try E there. इसको पीछे बहना. So there is obviously being referenced very consciously.
Yes.
But it seems that punishment increases as the time goes by. So that's very interesting. The other one, I would like to hear a bit more about the mythology. Is it larger satire? Is it very consistent about the colonial knowledge production? Lexicography of what kinds are is being attacked? Francesca, English question to this one.
Sorry?
How do you see the way of English?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, I think you can go. Who starts?
Okay. Should I start?
Microphone.
Allegory and satire. Allegory and satire. I mean, I think it's interesting that satire, of course, is very much part of this allegory. But what I find interesting in these two plays is that it's not just satire. No? So you've got satire, you've got the lament and pathos, you've got fun, you've got seriousness. So it's not just satire. So of course, satire is very much part of it. We've seen. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of allegorical satire is very prevalent, but it's not just that. The Place of Bengal, well, Bharat Bhiksha was written in response to Hemchandra Banerjee's Bengali poem of the same name, and Rosinka has written about it. Bharat Durdasha also, critics say that it was written in response to a play, but I don't know by whom. But I think we know that Bhartendu is looking to Bengal and what is happening there, whether in scholarship or in literature, in poems and plays. And it's part of this desire to replicate in Hindi a stage which is not really coming into, it's coming into existence only in kind of private, occasional forms and not in a kind of proper, and of course Vasudha has written a lot about it. There are, of course, other, precursors of allegory. I mean, Prabodha Chandrodaya, that's the first, this kind of more philosophical allegory that has a tradition, and that's one of the first things that Bhartendu translates. Pilgrim's Progress, of course, is very much around this time and translated and so on. But I think, what I wanted to show was that it's not that kind of simple allegory, that you've got these set of characters and we are supposed to read them in this allegory. It's really this jumble, no? And I think, I really like Crispini's idea of this groundwork. This groundwork that is done so that certain meanings and certain kind of connections of feelings and ideas and polarization sort of takes place. So I think all what you are saying and more is part of what these plays kind of bring together. English, again, to me, I suppose the most, of course, I was really struck by all these English characters, and the Allahabad session had an English president, some Richard Buell, I don't know exactly who he is. So you see that the English are also the children of India at this stage. Of course, the whole Victoria speaking with a sort of Hindi accent, but not so. Again, there seems to be a kind of sometimes it seems more ironical or funny or comical as we're used to. Know of this sort of English or English code mixing at this time as primarily debunking or parodying or funny. but also not. So to me, it was the serious English that was the most interesting. You know, this sort of serious English, the viceroy coming and speaking, and not to be made fun of, but to be actually seen as the savior. Only then in the next act to have a whole lot of complaints about, you know, in this kind of form of the witness. Agriculture says, you know, we are being, trade says we are being destroyed, you know, all of them be coming up. So it's, again, it's a really interesting ambivalence that is happening at this time.
Thank you for your question, Professor Kumkum. I completely agree with what you're trying to say, that these, the social scenario enacted is the same. But I think I agree with Professor Orsini in saying that satire is actually saying that they are incongruous, that the twain shan't meet. That in a sense that I remember a quote by Sayyid Ahmad Bilgrami saying that these days our elders are so prone to using English words in the Urdu lexicon that Zabane-Urdu-e-Mohalla will soon become Zabane-Urdu-e-Market. So there is an anxiety of English invading the Urdu lexicon. So it is staged out like that, like these are two incongruous scripts, and humor emanates from saying that these are two incongruous scripts. For instance, this cartoon, I did not have the time to show it. So the master is saying, now you bearer, tum Badgate company janta. Badgate company is a pharmacy. Ha sahib, dawai khana. Now dawai khana, if khana is pronounced khana with a slight change in pronunciation, and the colonial master says, not khana at all, you black infidel. I mean, you are always thinking about food. Khana would mean, khana is a verb to eat, basically. So humor is enacted in a way showing that these two cultures are incongruous. So I'm using Pratt's insights to bear upon humor in the sense to say that this is more of a linguistic zone of encounter. Because otherwise the decadent Nawabi is also satirized in Awadh Punch, and vehemently. Like there are novels where a decadent Nawab goes on to become a reformer, then he becomes a native gentleman, then he ends up in a mental asylum. So the Nawabi is critiqued in the Urdu periodical press, other than Awadh Punch also. Like for instance, Sarshar also in Fasana Azad is also critiquing the decadent Nawab. So what I'm saying is basically the contact zone. I'm using the contact zone here solely in terms of saying that it produces bilingualism, which becomes a source of humor.
No, I see that point, Mariam. I think the point I'm trying to make is that, you know, one has to be specific about colonialism.
Yeah.
And this particular colonialism is a meeting of two class societies.
Yeah.
This is not a meeting which is the more general referent of Pratt's work between, say, Native Americans and the Europeans, right? It's not like that.
Yeah, sure.
And what becomes special here is that the satire then can be simultaneously directed both ways.
Yeah.
For that reason, because there is some congruity, you know, the same can be read as, you know, satirical of, you know, elites in Britain as well as in India. And that, you know, is not something that comes through with Pratt's way of mapping politics.
Yeah, sure. Like, for instance, this cartoon.
No, sorry. No, she was answering.
So, for instance, this cartoon is. I found, like, while combing through my archives, I found 3 cartoons which were literal translations, and all 3 of them are selective. There's a selective culling of these cartoons. It's not an innocent culling, because in both these cartoons, in all 3 of these cartoons, the servant feigns some sort of innocence and some sort of ignorance, but it is the master who is satirized. So in Delhi Sketchbook, the satire becomes self-directed. When produced in Awadh Punch, it becomes some kind of a mocking of the reckless dealings of the commissioner. So it works a little differently, but the fact that it can be translated, again, that means that there is some congruity in attacking the classes. And even Delhi sketchbook was not just attacking the natives, it was attacking into the different class divisions in the East India Company officers, in the like the mess and all. So it was attacking, there was a lot of satire directed on its own. I mean, the satire was poured on itself. The native is not the target of satire in Delhi sketchbook also.
Look at the very interesting division of the room with the Munshi on one side,
Yeah,
right? And now the Munshi is, common to both hierarchies,
yeah,
the Nawabi and the British.
yeah.
And then there is this, suddenly this simulation of the library, fireplace, male space on the left.
Yeah.
Okay.
You also have the
Oh yeah. I think yours was in the nature of a comment, and thank you for that semantic connect between chor and chuha. Demacology is basically one single encyclopedia. So Awadh Panch comes out with its own fictive genres. So Muhammad Azad, who is also Panch Nigar, he comes out with Nai Roshni Ki Dictionary or the New Light Dictionary. So basically that is parodying the genre of lexicography. Then there is Nai Roshni Ki Encyclopedia. So these dictionary entries, like the one that I read out on Thanks, these are shorter ones. The encyclopedia entries are slightly longish ones, and they seem to define fictive disciplines which are which sort of satirize colonial rhetoric in a way. So for instance, there is cheeriology. What is cheeriology? Cheeriology is basically किसी चीज़ को चीरना, किसी चीज़ को चीर करके उस चीज़ में मतलब भर देना. And demacology, that branch of writing which is utterly useless and which literally attracts termites. So it's a new genre that Awadh Panch is coming up with, in addition to parodying older ones.
Okay, I think there is time for 3 questions. No more. 1, 2, and 3. Please.
I'll try and be brief. The first one is to Mariam. Mariam, you showed the Pindari codes and the, and I can see quite well aware that much of this, of course, has a predecessor in the newspapers that were published by the British in India. So starting from quite early. So in Calcutta, you begin to see these actually first in the English language newspapers, and then of course in the Bengali language. Quickly, just to also say that particular verse that you quoted about the monkeys in hats and boots, that's actually there in Ishwar Gupta's poetry in the 1840s in his paper, the Shambhat Prabhu, where he says babus with hats and boots.
Okay.
Who are, of course, monkeys to him, more or less. No, the question was really to do with, so you're aware that say, satires of Hafiz, satires of, all of this is already appearing in newspaper columns preceding these, but you're interested in the Awadh Panch, and you're interested in visuality and visual culture. So, this is not a question perhaps that can be answered right now, but I would ask you, if you can, to tell us a little bit about what visuality is doing to satire, because the mode of satire existed already in print, especially in these forms, of course, and even a sketch of manners right from the 1820s. You have books you have Alif Cheem, you have all these satirical, very popular books of satirical verse. There's a whole tradition of that has been written on quite a lot. You can research that very easily. Now the question is, what does visuality do to the same sort of thing when it's coming out in the form of these cartoons or what these sketches in so middle of the 19th century, a little later. So that was one, and the other for Francesca was just I wanted to know, do you have any information about audience responses, or how well they did, what the audience thought? Were they runaway successes, or what? That was just curiosity.
Please. Can I ask you to give me
जिसका मतलब ये बताइए, आप अंधेर नगरी को कैसे देखती हैं? क्योंकि अंधेर नगरी न किसी बांग्ला का अनुवाद है, बल्कि इसी क्षेत्र में प्रचलित लोक कथा के आधार पर एक नाटक लिखा गया है, जो कि उतना ही आलोचनात्मक है अंग्रेजी राज के प्रति भी जितना यहाँ भारतीय व्यवस्था के प्रति, खासकर जाति व्यवस्था के प्रति बहुत ज़्यादा आलोचनात्मक है. वो आप इस रूपक वाले नाटक में या व्यंग में या तंज में अंधेर नगरी को कैसे देखते हैं?
please. Last question.
Thank you. I'm sorry I missed Francesca's. I had something urgent coming up. So this question is to, I'll catch up with you later. This question is to Mariam. Actually, I was thinking, I was very interested when you said feigning of innocence by the native. So I am actually thinking about ignorance in this whole context of that. Ignorance in the whole context of that cartoon. And both the cartoons together, if you read them, there are two words, like one is Ravikant said, there is that he, and there is that or, like, this, you have to read this, if you read these two words together, you see that there's a perpetuation of that situation across time. So both these parties know that it is the same situation, and they are continuing in that particular situation across time. But when you said feigning of innocence, sometimes you feign innocence to reach a particular result. And in this particular case, if you're purposely, deliberately feigning innocence, but that is anyway not transformative, because there is no result. The perpetuation of that relationship, the dynamic of the relationship remains the same. So there is no transformation happening there. So if you are feigning innocence or in a particular way so that the transformation happens, then I understand. So I think the satire is directed towards ignorance itself, which is kind of filling that space. And the turning of the Munshi away from this, visually, the Munshi is turning that side. So there is a divide between, in my reading of the visual, there is a divide between ignorance and kind of knowledge, the possibility of knowledge, and the satire is directed at this whole thing of ignorance. I would like you to comment on.
Thank you very much. Can I ask for very, very short telegraphic answer?
So you said about, I think they were, I don't even know if Bharat Saubhagya was ever performed, no? So they exist as books. I think Bharat Durdasha gets performed, but it's amateur, student, those kind of productions. So it's not as if, but there's a big, plays are read a lot, it's a kind of a reading genre in Hindi rather than one that you watch. So I think you have to imagine it as being staged, but you're actually reading it. And about Andher Nagari, so Bhartendu has another very funny satiric, he has a whole range of satirical sketch, play and so on, so that's another of, I suppose pure Vyang, बस व्यंग ही व्यंग है, यहाँ व्यंग भी है और भी बहुत कुछ चल रहा है ना उसमें, so it's more combinatory, no? I suppose Andher Nagari has, even if bit it's more narrative, and then there's of course the whole fun of the market scene and everything is selling for the same price. So it's, I would say, it's just one more of a whole range of satirical writing that Bhartendu does.
Thank you, Rosenka, for that very interesting insight. So illustrations were obviously, this is not the first instance of illustration in Urdu literature at all. So illustrations occur before Awadh Panch. What cartoon is bringing into play is a literalization of metaphors. What I mean by that, I don't have a cartoon to show right now, is for instance there is a cartoon of Lord Curzon holding a piece of cake which is marked the native state of Bengal, and he's carving it out with a knife labeled Hikmat-e-Amli or strategy. So what we see is an allegorization or a literalization of these metaphors, and cartoons basically don't occur in the sense that we understand political cartoons now. So these are not literal caricatures of certain figures. Other than Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, he is the only one who is taken pot shots at. Other than that, there is no personal lampooning. What we see is a literalization or a physiognomization of these metaphors. So, for instance, taxation becomes a devil, or a particular bill will become a ghost, which is haunting a dead man. It's not dying, it's not living, it's like in this kind of a limbo state. So that's what caricature is bringing, that's what's new about caricature, which it is bringing into play in the Urdu periodical press. The other question, I really have to think about this cartoon more thoroughly then. Satire, I think, yeah, the Munshi, for instance, is indolent throughout Delhi sketchbook. He's never looking at his colonial master in the eye. He's shown as a sleepy figure. And these figures recur without any transformation throughout. So he's a type, and he's always looking away no matter what. I think satire, yeah, it is directed at the colonial master, but it functions differently in Delhi sketchbook and Awadh Punch. For instance, in Delhi sketchbook, most of the cartoons are premised on a mutual unintelligibility of the language. So it works in that register in Delhi sketchbook. In Awadh Punch, it is more towards the, like for instance, this cartoon is titled Insaf. So it is more to show the reckless dealings, or more to attack the colonial policies of the colonial policies of the masters, basically.
I can agree for more. No, I understand that these two are valid, what you say, but beyond these two also, there is a realm of ignorance which is being satirized. So that realm of ignorance is not really the register of either this or that, but is beyond that. So the cartoonist has that oblique insight into that realm of insight and a capacity to satirize. So that thing, maybe you need to look at other extra textual things to understand what are the factors that contribute to that realm of ignorance and the perpetuation of that realm of ignorance, and how the cartoonist gains a capacity to obliquely critique it.
Okay.
About this particular one once more, Mariam, you might want to think of that figure of the servant as the figure of the translator between the Munshi and the boss.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it was very lively, very interesting session. Thank you to all presenters. And don't leave the room. Now there is a last but not least panel.
Excellent.
So thank you very much for being here for the last but not least panel of our exciting workshop. This panel is on novels writing history, and we will have two presentations and then the discussion. So the first paper is Vasudha Dalmia's The Anglo-Indian Woman as the Author in the Hindi Novel.
So actually I'm writing about the so-called Western woman, because I'm also talking about an Indian Christian, not just Anglo-Indian, and they did differentiate between the two. They began to appear in the Hindi novel from the 1920s on, embodying modes of behavior not available to the Hindu characters who otherwise people the novels. I have focused in my paper on three novels, one written in 1925 by the famous Hindu Urdu writer Premchand, which is called Rang Bhumi, Theatre Space or Stage, written, and the other that I'll be talking about here, I won't talk about three, I'll talk about two, is Dharamveer Bharti's Gunaho Ka Devta, published in 1949. So 1925 and 1949 are my two novels. Anglo-Indians as a community came into being from around the 18th century on, when Europeans first appeared on the Indian landscape in numbers sufficient to make their presence felt. This resulted in a mixed population which acquired distinct characteristics even as the boundaries of the community remained porous in both directions, the European, largely British, and Indian. The union which produced these children of mixed parentage usually consisted of a British father and an Indian mother. Both parents were likely to belong to the bottom rungs of the social ladder, the father often being a British soldier who may or may not have stayed on in the country, and the mother a lower caste, a Hindu, or not or Muslim woman, which last fact, the Indian mother, as Lionel Kaplan points out, may go some way to explain the collective amnesia concerning female ancestors among many Anglo-Indian families. By and large, most Anglo-Indians were employed in lower white-collar jobs as clerical officers, surveyors, apothecaries, engineers, and so on, below Europeans but above Indians. Before independence, the Anglo-Indian community identified closely with the British, with whom they shared not only religion but also language, dress, and mode of domesticity. Anglo-Indian children were baptized as Christians, partly as a cultural guard against the Indian mother. They also adopted English as their first language. They were also given from 1911, they were officially classed as Anglo-Indians rather than Eurasians, etc. With the Morley-Minto reforms of 1909 and following these the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms of 1918, Anglo-Indians were recognized as a separate community and granted a representation in the Legislative Assembly that was then created. This served to further set them apart. This in spite of the fact that they were a relatively tiny community, a mere 500,000 at the time of Indian independence in 1947. With this we come to the focus of this presentation, the role of Anglo-Indians as also Indian Christian women in their society as much as in the depiction outside it. Two factors serve to distinguish them from surrounding Hindu and Muslim society, as Kaplan points out. There is wide agreement, I quote, bordering on stereotype, both within and outside the community, that young Anglo-Indians, and especially women, differ from other Indians in having a great deal of freedom to meet the other sex. This has also meant the freedom to choose their own marriage partners. The men freely propose marriage and women are free to accept them. The second factor is the freedom to seek and find work outside the domestic sphere. That this leads to their being seen as a social threat and to the formation of stereotypes about Anglo-Indian women as sirens and excessively sexualized in both British and Indian discourse is not surprising. In the close readings that follow, I shall be asking in what ways the Christian Anglo-Indian women concerned are regarded as other, and how the novels seek to deal with this otherness. Okay, so now I come to the first novel. It's an epic novel, 500 pages long, so I have had my trouble shortening it to suit this presentation. Let me see if I can present the plotline in some coherent fashion. Premchand, a famous Hindi-Urdu writer, wrote Rangbhumi, his third major novel, in the early 1920s and published his Hindi version in 1925. It is a tale largely set in Varanasi, the holy city, the city regarded as holy by Hindus in North India. One of its central characters is a Christian woman, Sophia. The narrative begins and ends with her story. She is introduced in the first episode, so she does not figure as a stereotype, though her Christianity will figure largely in the story and how she herself deals with things. She is introduced in the first episode as intelligent, sensitive, kind-hearted, with large sensuous eyes, a modest young woman. Her body was extremely tender, as if she had been created out of flowers. instead of the 5 elements. There is no further description of her physical appearance. So she's not sexualized in the same way that Anglo-Indian women tend to be otherwise. The family was converted only 3 generations ago, perhaps originally by force. Their ways are deliberately and self-consciously anglicized. Mrs. Sevak aspires to higher social status than that usually awarded Indian Christians. She is averse to Hindustanis. In Mrs. Sevak's opinion, by seeking refuge with Jesus Christ, the family had been, and I quote, freed from the vices of Hindustanis. She was a devotee of European civilization and followed their manners and customs in food habits, dress, way of life. Her only drawback was her darker-hued complexion. Her one ambition in life was to emerge from the ranks of Christians and become one with the English, so that people recognize them as sahibs. That their social contacts be with the English and their children marry Anglo-Indians or at the least high-ranking Eurasians. As Indian Christians, the Sevaks would be considered socially a notch below Anglo-Indians. Now we come back to Sophia, the daughter. Sophia is an intellectual. She's strong-willed. She takes bold action. That is her hallmark, and it is this characteristic which drives her story forward. Though she herself is at pains to stress that she considers Jesus Christ a great man, Mahapurush, she is deeply analytical in her approach to religion. She studies philosophical and religious texts avidly, also of other faiths and their philosophical systems, Jainism, Buddhism, Vedanta, seeking to resolve her grave doubts about Christianity. She contrasts the narrowness of Mrs. Sevak's creed with the openness of Hinduism. As she muses, I have seen with what love people of differing faiths live with each other. If the father is Sanatani, traditional, the son is an Arya Samaji, reformist. The husband is in the Brahmo Samaj, iconoclasts. The wife believes in stone images. No one objects to the other. But we crush souls. In spite of that, we maintain that our education and civilization nurture freedom of thought. So she's very rebellious. She says, I'll show them that I can stand on my own feet. Living in this house now is like living in hell. So she defies her family, her grandfather, her parents, particularly her mother, in her attitude towards Christianity. In her dissatisfaction with them and a first attempt to leave them, she strolls through the city. Now this is a very independent act, to just walk through the city. And then it happens that she sees a fire in the mansion she is passing, and she rushes to rescue a young man she sees caught in the fire. She will fall in love with Vinay Singh, this young man, and he with her. He is an idealist from a noble family. She will live with them for a while. Vinay's father, Kumar Bharat Singh, their nobility, and mother Janvi support him in his fervent nationalism. He leads a group of young men called his Seva Dal, service group in various social actions. The tension is generated by the different religions of the two in this love story, along with the tale of the blind beggar Surdas, which it becomes entwined with it. For strategic and other reasons, Sophia aligns herself with an Englishman, the district magistrate, Mr. Clark. But she realizes that she still loves Vinay. She has heard that he is in prison in Udaipur, in Rajasthan, where he has been banished by his mother because the authorities there do not trust his popularity with the people, so he's stuck into prison. Sophia thinks if Mr. Clark is sent to Udaipur, he can help free Vinay. Now Sophia takes action so bold that she surprises even Mr. Clark. She accompanies Mr. Clark to Udaipur, though she's not yet officially betrothed to him. She says she needs time. She's not even sure whether marriage is the answer for someone as free-thinking as she. Once in Udaipur, she takes further courageous action. She abandons all scruples, managing to see Vinay alone in his prison cell. She confesses that she has deceived Clark in order to help him Vinay. The wall of belonging to different faiths that separates them, she says, is man-made. It can be pierced, and for the first time, the lovers confess their love to each other directly. Eventually, she and Vinay manage to come together again and live incognito for a year with Bhil tribals in a village. So they're living together again. You see, now just imagine what boldness it needs for a woman to simply live together with a man. They're not married. Physically, they're never intimate, but mentally and emotionally, they are together. Now a whole lot of things happen in the tale which I can't relate here. Eventually, everyone in the family agrees to their marriage, and but Sophie is still afraid that something will happen to prevent the marriage. But what I'm interested in is that even at this late stage in her tale, the narrator remains preoccupied with Sophia's otherness. One of the last chapters begins with the words, Sophia's religious beliefs, her manners and customs, her way of life, her education and upbringing were of the kind which could inspire aversion in a Hindu woman. But the experience of the last days had resolved all doubts that Vinay's mother, Rani Janhavi, could have about her. Sophia had not yet been initiated formally in Hinduism, but her behavior followed Hindu religion and Hindu society entirely. Janhavi had not a trace of doubt regarding this. The union is not to be. Vinay is killed in action in a satyagraha in the city of Banaras, and, or rather he kills himself, and with Vinay's death, there's nothing left for Sophia to live for. She rejoins her family for her time. Mrs. Sevak thinks she's come back to the fold. Mr. Clark thinks that she will marry him. But she leaves the house one night, and she leaves a letter for Rani Janhavi. She has gone to immerse herself in the river. She leaves a letter behind, and this letter says, "My dear Vinay is calling me. He has not a moment's peace without me. I go to meet him. The worldly raiment here is a hindrance in my path, therefore I leave it behind me here. I entrust it to the Ganga. My heart thrills, my feet fly, each pore is filled with delight. I will soon see Vinay." It is in merging with the holy river of the Hindus that her own transformation into an Arya Mahila comes about. And it is complete, so to speak. Thus it is that though Rani Janhavi and Vinay's proclamations about her Hinduness dot the narrative, traces of her otherness are wiped out only in the end when Dr. Ganguly, the Rani's associate, calls her a sati who had followed the dharma of a sati by taking her life. As we see, there is a fascination with Sophia's otherness, but also at times a repulsion from about where she comes from, her Christian family. Her behavior has a freedom and boldness denied the Hindu woman at her time, and it has a forthrightness which creates its own trail of action. At the same time, though she is sympathetically depicted, the narrative makes incessant moves to assimilate her, to say she's almost become Hindu. She's an Arya Mahila, she's a Hindu woman. Though she dresses, or though she does this, and though she does that, she's one of us. This was only obliterated in her death. We have to remember that she has to be killed at the end of the tale. She's never able to marry her Vinay. She has to be killed in order to become a true sati. Do you have 5 minutes?
Yeah.
So my second novel I'll talk about only in 5 minutes. Let's see what I'm able to put across. This is the much later novel, written in 1949. And here, the Anglo-Indian woman appears much more as a stereotype. Not entirely, but she's excessively sexualized, and she's described physically, which Sophia never is. You know, a faint French perfume clung to her, what she wore, her long nails were painted pale pink, she had an air of informality, she's excessively intimate with the hero of the story. The hero of the story and the heroine, who is an innocent young Hindu woman, cannot come together because they belong to different castes. And they idealize their love, and the woman is married off. The hero, Chandar, is actually quite desperate in his grief, something that he had not reckoned with. And he turns to this Anglo-Indian woman for comfort. She comforts him, she consoles him, she gives herself to him, she's very generous with him. This is what impresses me, that she really comes to his rescue out of compassion for him also. Yet, she's treated, in the end, of course, he rejects her. There can be no way that they can come together. When she finds herself, when she feels a distance between them, she also leaves him. But in going away, this is what, she demeans herself. She also leaves a letter behind, in which she demeans herself, in which she also portrays herself as a kind of opium for him, and that she had used her sexuality to win his love. She confesses that to him. But she degrades herself. She says she's actually not capable of love because the love she feels is of a very ephemeral emotion. And then she says, and this is what I find so interesting, and I will end with this. I'm a Christian, but after my experiences, I have realized that the Hindu system, which looks at marriage through the prism of social and religious circumstances and not love, is more scientific and much better for women. Maybe there are some restrictions to the woman, but there is also responsibility and contentment, and she is the queen of the house. Like Sophia in Rangbhumi, she is made to subscribe to Hindu social and religious codes, though unlike her, she makes no attempt to enter the Hindu fold. Beautiful, strong, bold, independent, and direct in her communication, at the end of the tale, this Anglo-Indian woman, Mummy, is made to crawl back, so to speak, to a Hindu court. Thank you. Oh, good.
Come vuoi. Thank you very much for this exciting paper. And now we have Wuldevul Kerati Dirar, who's going to talk about writing war and colonialism in Tigrinya.
Thank you very much, Etha. And as I say to some of you, it's kind of embarrassing to be the last one because I feel as if I am an obstacle between you and your lunch, shopping, families, and whatever. So I apologize for that. I'll try to be as short and as lively as possible in order to. Yeah, I know, it's an Astor convention. Before starting my presentation, I'd like just to spend a few seconds to thank deeply and sincerely the organizer for inviting me first of all here, but also for this extremely rich and enriching and provocative and exciting workshop. I really learned a lot, and it was embarrassing because every night I was like rethinking, rewriting mentally my presentation because so many new inputs were coming to my mind. So what is my paper about is part of a research project on the impact of World War I in the Horn of Africa. So it's actually I'm using literary text, but really from a kind of much more narrow perspective with regard to what I've heard here is more focused on history and how those two texts can be relevant from a historiographic perspective and from the point of view of social history. As Francesca asked, a little bit of background because you are not obliged to know where is Eritrea. Actually, nobody knows it. So wherever I say I'm Eritrean, they ask where is Eritrea, and I say, okay, I'm Ethiopian. So let's say Ethiopia, everybody knows where it is. Anyway, Eritrea is this tiny country in Northeast Africa. It has been part of Ethiopia actually until 1991. Then a long struggle has led to its independence. But I will focus on the colonial time. Eritrea was actually the first Italian colony in Africa between 1869 and 1941, though formally it is considered a colony only from 1890.